police at your door, and they inform you that your 20-year-old son was killed by a drunk driver. It's a parent's nightmare. Now imagine 2 days later learning that the drunk driver had a record of multiple drunk driving arrests and was in the U.S. illegally. You would realize that your son should still be alive if any number of people who encountered him had done their job to enforce immigration laws and criminal laws. Unfortunately, we become aware of these preventable crimes on a weekly, sometimes daily basis right now, because in its desire to fundamentally transform America, the left has knowingly and intentionally created the perfect storm of open borders, lack of immigration enforcement, refusal to prosecute or detain criminals, and a refusal to share criminal information with ICE or honor ICE detainers to turn criminal aliens over for deportation. To discuss these issues, we've got a great lineup of speakers today. We have Simon Hankinson, who's a senior research fellow at Heritage's Border Security and Immigration Center and a retired career Foreign Service officer. Tom Homan, a visiting fellow with our Border Security and Immigration Center and the former ICE acting director. U.S. Senator Doc Marshall from Kansas, and Zach Smith, the senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He is also the co-author of the book Rogue Prosecutors: How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. So now I will invite Simon up to begin diving into these issues and to discuss new publication coming out today, as well as a new interactive data visualization tool released today on preventable crimes. Thank you. Simon?
Thank you, Lauren. Good morning, everybody. Well, 25 years ago, I started my career as a Foreign Service officer on the visa line in New Delhi, India. And every day, with a pen and paper, I would interview at least 150 people for visas. They were coming for business meetings in New York, maybe going to Disney World or to study at MIT, a range of purposes. And it was my job to decide whether they should have the privilege of entering the United States. Each applicant had to convince me he was going to America to do what he said he would. He had to convince me that he would return home at the end of his stay. He had to convince me that he was who he claimed to be and that he hadn't lied on his application form. After 9/11, they used to say that every visa decision is a national security decision. And I once had lunch with a guy who issued half of the 9/11 hijackers their visas, and so we all knew what that meant. I probably did 100,000 visa interviews as a consular officer, and I'm sure I got some decisions wrong, but I did my best, without prejudice or favor, to decide who was qualified under the law to come to the United States. Fast forward to May 2022. I retired from the State Department and came here to the Heritage Foundation to work on border security and immigration issues. And the most shocking thing I found was that most national security decisions of who gets into our country are no longer made by American officers. Under President Biden, what was a privilege has now become a right. We've outsourced the decision on who gets into the country to foreign nationals. We still have a visa system, but it's an expensive front door with fees, fingerprints, photos, and interviews. And how can this compete with a wide-open back door at the southern border? There, the Department of Homeland Security pretty much releases most people who show up. There are no fees, no forms, and no way to routinely verify a name, age, or identity. Worst of all, there are no criminal background checks in the person's home country or anywhere else they pass through on the way here. DHS has to pretty much take it on trust. And then on top of the catch and release at the border, President Biden invented, against both the spirit and intent of the law, parole programs that have brought in almost 1 million more unverified foreign nationals, many of them young men. So it's not only that the administration is failing to secure the border, they're actively trying to bring in as many unverified people as they can. So what could go wrong? Well, a lot. The open border, I think, can be linked to crimes committed all over the country, crimes that were preventable because the perpetrators had no right to be here. Like the MS-13 gang member who murdered Kayla Hamilton in July of 2022, right in our neighboring state of Maryland. Thugs like him can easily get into this country now by hiding their criminal records and gang ties so they get released to seek asylum if they give themselves up, or by just sneaking in among the estimated 2 million gotaways that have arrived since 2021. The new report that I hope we're publishing any second now looks at crimes, it identifies crimes where the perpetrator would not have been able to enter the United States or be allowed to remain here unmolested because of deliberate policy choices coming from the White House. Now, many of these people entered, I would say the vast majority, after President Biden took office, but some entered before and were just not arrested or deported despite presenting a clear risk to society. There are all kinds of different cases, but they fall into some basic categories. For instance, asylum claimants. Once present in the United States, a foreign national can claim asylum. And that puts them into a giant backlog of millions of cases that will take many, many years to get through. After 6 months, they can apply to work here. That's honestly the reason why so many people file applications for asylum, even though they don't have a case, because the majority, I think 85, 90% are refused. In a year, the administration deports fewer people than they let in a month. So you do the math, it really doesn't take very long for that pile to get awfully big. We feed more people into this backlog every single day. Another category of cases are the so-called catch and release. These are people who are supposed to be detained at the border. That's what the U.S. law requires. For the whole process of their immigration hearings, whatever it turns out to be, if they claim asylum or if they end up getting deported. DHS right now releases most of those people and they just disappear. Very few of them are actually monitored in any way. One of them was Giovanni Rivera Zavala, a 29-year-old from Honduras, who was charged in 2023 with sexually assaulting a girl in a restaurant bathroom in Alabama. He came in 2021 using a fake name. He had a criminal record in Honduras, but DHS released him anyway within a couple of days. Now, Zavala and similar cases belie the government's claims that aliens are carefully vetted before they're being released into our communities or paroled. Many aliens deliberately throw away their documents. I've seen piles of them at the border every time I visit, and they provide no ID to border agents, or they just make up a fake name. But even if they did provide ID, DHS just doesn't have a way to check criminal records in all of the countries that these people come from, over 160 countries. So unless they have a prior criminal record here in the United States, it's pretty much taken on faith. And the vetting of illegal aliens, despite what Homeland Security will tell us, is dangerously inadequate. And in the U.S., over 80% of state prisoners reoffend within 10 years of being released. So let's assume that aliens who are released or paroled at the border and have criminal records reoffend at the same rate. Who assumes that risk? It's American communities. The president is asking Americans to assume the risk that the home countries of these convicts should assume. And there are 400,000 convicted criminal aliens roaming in the United States who are all deportable. And with the numbers in DHS's annual target being about 30,000 this year, again, a little math will tell you that it's going to be over a decade before even the supply that's here now would be removed. And obviously, we're adding probably more than 30,000 a year. Another category is so-called gotaways. These are people who just enter the country. We have some sign that they entered, maybe a footprint or a camera recording them, but we have no idea who they are. We don't know where they've gone. And because it's so easy now to just surrender to Border Patrol, the people who are the gotaways who are entering without inspection very often have things to hide, like lengthy criminal records in the United States. Give you one example. There was a Salvadoran who entered without inspection on an unknown date. He was arrested in 2016 in Maryland for trespassing. Charges were dropped. He was arrested in 2017 for domestic violence. He was arrested in 2018 for assault, but charges were dropped. He was arrested in 2019 and charged with drunk driving. He was arrested again in 2022. This time he didn't have the ignition lock that habitual drunk drivers are supposed to have to stop them starting their car. He was convicted and sentenced to a year in jail and served 4 days before they let him out again on parole. And finally, in 2023, ICE agents arrested him and confirmed that he was actually an MS-13 gang member. So the whole time, this guy had been living here for 8 years. He was a gang member and a habitual drunk driver, a risk to the communities that he was living in Maryland, and he was able to live unmolested. Then we turn to parole cases. Now, this is a category that was supposed to be used very sparingly. That's what the law says. That's what the Jordan Commission said in 1996. And yet, the Biden administration has used it to let in people from China, Russia, and other countries hostile to the U.S., including countries known to harbor active terrorist groups. Then they created these new mass programs for Afghans, Ukrainians, Cubans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, Venezuelans, family unification. We're talking about almost 1 million people right now. One of the people that came in under parole was Jose Ibarra from Venezuela, who came in 2022 at El Paso. He was granted parole and released into the country. He was arrested a year later for driving without a license in New York, but police released him. That's what they tend to do in New York City. Later, he and his brother were caught shoplifting in Georgia, but they only got a misdemeanor citation and they were steered towards a pre-arrest diversion program. Well, it didn't work because in February of 2024, Ibarra was arrested for the murder of 22-year-old Laken Riley, who was a nursing student just out taking a jog in broad daylight. People lie on their visa applications all the time. I've, like I said, done 100,000 applications. Most people are honest. Some people aren't. Felix Moreno was wanted in his native Panama for murder, but he managed to get a visa by lying about his record. He overstayed, and ICE eventually caught up with him a year later. Now, we automatically share criminal records with countries in the visa waiver program, but not with countries who have to apply for a visa. We have to make a special effort to get that. So that's why we need ICE to be on the lookout for these people, to be doing its job out there making sure people don't overstay their visas, and if they do, that they are called to account for it. So every day that an ICE officer or someone who should be doing enforcement is down on the border making sandwiches and booking air tickets and handing out bottles of water is people like this guy who are let go. And then we have my favorite category. I call it, if at first you don't succeed, voluntary return. In October last year, ICE in Philadelphia finally removed, I shouldn't say finally because I'm sure he'll be back, Juan Martinez Merida. He's wanted for murder in Mexico. He'd been detained at the U.S. border at least 7 times and allowed voluntary return each time, which basically just doesn't go on his record other than in their system. If you have no consequences for bad behavior, we have proved in just about every walk of life that bad behavior just gets worse. So allowing people like Merida to return voluntarily more than once, much less 7 or 8 times, it just simply is feckless law enforcement. If someone enters illegally more than once, they should be held to account with prosecution and a serious penalty if we want there to be any deterrent effect. Now, Secretary Mayorkas has repeatedly claimed, and I'm quoting now, that people who cross our border unlawfully and without a legal basis to remain will be promptly processed and removed. And I'm sorry, I'm a diplomat by training, but that is a flat-out lie. He knows it, I know it, you know it. This is not a partisan political thing. That is just not true. All last year, ICE removed about half as many aliens as are allowed in every single month. So at the end of 2023, there were over 6 million aliens on ICE's non-detained docket, which is all the people who are in process in deportation proceedings and are not in ICE or criminal detention. I think there's about 1.2 million aliens who have final orders of removal. In other words, the judge has said, they've had the due process, I'm very sorry, you can't stay, and they're still here. And I already talked about the 400,000. So as I began writing this report, which turned into a whole team effort, I brought it to my boss, and she said, there's way too many examples. People just aren't going to read past the first one. And I said, you're right, but what are we going to do? I worked on all these examples, and they keep coming in. It's just, terrible. So my colleague Matt Kuckelman and our geniuses in the visual data team came up with this map that we're about to show you, where it's not a comprehensive list. I just want to be really clear about that you can't just point to a state and go, oh, there's only one case, that's no problem. This is just a sampling, and we're growing cases as we get them in. We want to make sure that they're verified because I'll give you an example of how it's difficult to verify crimes that are committed by people who shouldn't be here. If I were to go to Paris as a tourist and rob a bank, do you think the headline would say, Paris man robs bank in the French newspapers? No, it wouldn't. But if you read local papers and national papers in the U.S., that's frequently what it says because it's a toxic subject for them. They do not want to address whether this person had legal status in the U.S., and I think that's something Americans have a right to know, whatever your views are on immigration. So we use this mounting evidence that's coming in every week of crimes that could have been prevented. That's the key to this map. It's not all crimes by all illegal immigrants. That would be a far bigger map than this one. It would just be all one big red blotch. These are crimes that, as far as we could tell, were preventable. Either the person should have been deported, should have been arrested, there was a detainer that wasn't enforced, local law enforcement dropped the ball, they were let in on parole without a proper background check, they were released at the border even though they should have been detained, and all those other examples that I cited. So with that, we're going to show you a sample of the map, and hopefully you can check it out later as it starts to grow.
Under the Biden administration, America has seen rising crime driven in part by open border policies which welcome criminal illegal aliens and encourage and allow them to remain in the United States. The federal government and its local and state allies have made policy choices which encourage criminals to illegally enter the country and in many cases remain free after committing crimes in the United States. In response to this crisis, the Heritage Foundation is launching a new data visualization tool. Border insecurity and lax law enforcement lead to preventable crime. With this tool, Americans can navigate through preventable crimes committed across the country. Every state is now very much a border state, and border insecurity and lax law enforcement lead to preventable crime shows that. Incidents can be navigated in several ways with this tool. First, users can use the drop-down menu to select their state. They will then see a list of incidents. Details on each incident can be expanded by clicking on the date and location. Users can also click on their state on the map, which will display the incident list. Finally, users can click on a specific dot, which will show the information on a specific incident. Each incident will display the date and location. Users can also see the subject and the subject's country of origin. This tool includes categories which define the specific policies that enabled the individual to commit a crime. For example, catch and release indicates that the individual was encountered trying to enter the country illegally by federal officials, but was allowed to enter the United States anyway. Primary crimes and charges indicate the crime which the individual has been convicted of or charged with in the United States. Each case includes an overview, which provides a brief summary of the history of the case. To be clear, this tool provides just a sample of the preventable harm being done in communities across the United States. Border insecurity and lax law enforcement lead to preventable crime will be regularly updated to provide current information on preventable crimes happening across the country. To access the tool, please visit heritage.org/immigration or datavisualizations.heritage.org. That's heritage.org/immigration or datavisualizations.heritage.org. Preventable crimes occur every day across the country. Border insecurity and lax law enforcement allows the American people to see the very real harm being done in their communities as a result of open border policy choices. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to Matt Kuckelman, who did the voiceover for that, as well as all the work putting it together. I'd now like to reintroduce Tom Homan, former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. No one knows more about this topic than Tom, so I think he can enlighten us a little more.
So I listened very closely to what Simon was saying. Everything he said, I agree with 100%, so well done. Look, I looked at the stats just this morning in the parking lot. Under Biden administration, they've arrested 156,000 criminals on the border, CBP, Border Patrol, and OFO. 156,000 approximately, a little more. Criminal people either had a criminal conviction or had an outstanding criminal warrant. Think about that. That's who we are arrested. You pay the cartels 2 months of smuggling fees. You pay a fee just across the border and turn yourself in. It's a pretty, a couple $1,000, a few $1,000, and you can just cross the border and turn yourself in. Pretty simple job. Cartel work starts and ends on the border. But you pay a lot more if you want to be a getaway. If you want to get to New York, Chicago, and not get arrested, you're going to pay a lot more. So Simon mentioned earlier, 2 million plus, 2 million known gotaways under this administration so far. Over 2 million. You got to ask yourself a question. Why did 2 million people pay more to get away? Why wouldn't you pay less to turn yourself in, get released within 24 hours, get a free plane ticket to the city of your choice, get a free hotel room, get 3 meals a day, get free medical care, and get work authorization in a matter of 1 or 2 months. Who the hell doesn't take advantage of that giveaway program for less money? Why pay more to get away? That just scared the hell out of everybody. It does me. There's a reason. These are gang members. These are criminals. These are people. No, these, actually, the number since Biden's been president is 181 countries now. Some of these countries are sponsors of terror. Border Patrol's arrested 358 crossing the border, southern border, almost twice as many at the northern border. So if they arrested 358 trying to sneak in the southern border, how many 2 million came from a country sponsoring terror? If you think it's zero, God help you. This is the biggest national security failure I've seen in this country in my lifetime. I truly believe something's coming. I don't know when. I don't know how many terrorists have crossed this border in this president, but we're going to find out, and it's going to be a bad day for America. I was a director of ICE. I was actually the first director, actually came up through the ranks. So I spent decades looking for criminal aliens. Under this administration, the Secretary of Mayorkas, who should have been impeached 2.5 years ago, has told ICE, being in the country illegally on its own isn't enough to make an arrest. Basically tell them you can't enforce immigration law. They got to be convicted of a serious crime before you target them for arrest. Well, considering the largest cities in this nation are sanctuary cities that don't work with ICE, considering sanctuary cities don't even ask where the person is born when they're processing them, how's that working out? In the last 3.5 years of historic illegal immigration, ICE has the lowest number of removals in the history of the agency. Secretary Mayorkas also set ICE new priorities on what criminals they can arrest. I looked at the list of the ICE arrests in the last 3 years compared to the Trump years. First of all, let's be clear. There's no reason to reprioritize. 91% of everybody we arrested under Trump was a convicted criminal or pending criminal charges. 9 out of 10. That's pretty good prioritization. There was no need for Mayorkas to either narrow it some more. It wasn't about narrowing criminal convictions. It was about shutting down ICE. I always said they'll never abolish ICE, but they'll abolish the mission. And that's exactly what they did. So the new priorities under Secretary Mayorkas, you got to be convicted of the most serious crimes. So I looked at it. The criminals we arrested on the Trump administration, according to my math, 81% of them are off the table with this administration. 81% of the criminals we arrested in the Trump administration cannot be arrested under this administration. That puts this country at grave harm. Not only is this the biggest national security crisis in my career, my lifetime, it's the biggest public safety crisis, and we're seeing it go across the nation. Sanctuary cities exploded under this administration. Rikers Island alone, New York City. Rikers Island alone. We used to have 12 agents there a shift. We got nobody there now. You just take hundreds of criminals off our Rikers Island. Not anymore. And as far as I want to end with this, Laken Riley. This administration failed her family 3 different times. How? Because the man that killed her, first of all, shouldn't have been here. If he wants to claim asylum under the Trump administration, he would have been in the Remain in Mexico program. His ass would have been sent to Mexico. And let's say he made it into the United States. Under the Trump administration, he would have been sitting in an ICE bed. Thousands of empty ICE beds right now at $127 a night sit empty, but they'll put them in a hotel room $500 a night. Why? Because if you're not detained, you get order removal, you only get removed 6% of the time. That's how they release them. So they failed him by not having the Remain in Mexico program, which the Supreme Court told him to put back in place, and he didn't. They failed him because he wasn't in an ICE detention facility like he would have been under the Trump administration. And third, they want to blame NYPD for not contacting ICE. Let's be truthful. When NYPD arrested him for endangerment of a child, even if they contacted ICE, he didn't meet the threshold for ICE to even drop a detainer. ICE went and got him anyways. So this administration is failing not only the hundreds of angel moms and dads that I personally met who want to talk about family separation, they bury their children. That's a separation. So that's what's happening. I'm looking forward to speaking some more about it, and I think I'm introducing from the great state of Kansas, Senator Marshall. Will you come on up and say a few words, please, sir?
Well, good morning, and I want to thank Heritage for the opportunity to speak on this important issue. Over 3 years ago, it was very evident to me that this open southern border was going to be a defining issue for this coming election. And when 6 months ago, 9 months ago, I said this will be the number one issue. And in my town halls that we do, and we do telephone town halls, we're speaking tens of thousands of Kansas at a time. Even then, I said this will absolutely be the number one defining issue of this election, despite horrible inflation and the grocery situation and the price of gasoline and all that stuff. And sure enough, this is becoming the defining issue. And why? It's because Americans no longer feel that they're safe and secure. We lose a Kansan every day to fentanyl poisoning. We're using Narcan 10 to 20 times every day in the state of Kansas. And just remind you, geographically, we're in the middle of the country. My dad was a police officer, became the chief of police for 25 years in my hometown. And what he taught me, among many other things, is that Kansas sits at the crossroads for drug trafficking. So for decades, drugs have come from whichever direction, from the south, from the east, and the west, and Kansas is there at that bisection. So we have a disproportionate amount of drug arrests. And then the second thing my dad taught me was, if you're having spikes in crime, it's related to drug trafficking. That is the main driver of crime. And now we have human trafficking coming along behind it, a spike in human trafficking. People often pay for their drug addiction with human trafficking as well. We've done multiple roundtables in Kansas with law enforcement. And in the theme that we're seeing continuously is this interaction between human trafficking and the drug cartels. And just to put this, succinctly, the Mexican cartels drive the fentanyl and the drug trafficking, but the Chinese triad drives the human trafficking and the money laundering on the end of it. Okay, and they're doing it with crypto. 99% of the cyber attacks are being paid off in crypto. Crypto is the currency for criminals. Wherever I travel across the world, within 5 minutes, the local U.S. law enforcement people are going to talk to me about crypto, which is one of the reasons that Senator Warren and I have legislation that would require cryptocurrencies to know their customers just like banks do, so that they could be prosecuted as well. Could talk a lot about the money laundering part of this, the human trafficking part of this, and then I want to tie in marijuana to this piece as well. This is not one problem. So I'm a physician. I see all these problems, as one huge problem. Kansas, again, sits between Colorado and Oklahoma, states that have legalized marijuana. I tell you what, I tried to listen to people that thought we could legalize marijuana, and I'm telling you, it would be the worst thing that society could do right now. The law enforcement officers have just reinforced with me, do not legalize marijuana. The marijuana leads to psychosis. It leads to depression. It's a gateway drug. It's a crime is centered around. All those things are true, okay, despite what the far left is telling you. All those things are very, 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 very true. But what's happened now in Oklahoma and Colorado are the Chinese triad has come in and owned the legal farms, and then they're going all this illegal marijuana behind it. So people ask me, where are these 140,000 Chinese nationals gone that have crossed the border? Well, a lot of them are the slave labor, the human trafficking labor on the marijuana farms. They call them weed farms. It is the vernacular for the law enforcement, or weed farms. And what we're seeing again is that's being trafficked through Kansas. And my law enforcement officers, every one of these roundtables, they tell me the same thing. We cannot arrest ourselves out of this. You could triple the law enforcement officers we have in Kansas, and we cannot arrest ourselves out of it. And then they shake their fist at me and say, what is Joe Biden thinking? Why can't we get this through anyone's head that this is a real problem? And I don't have that answer. My parents, asked me that question. What is Joe Biden thinking when here's his policies? And all I can say is, look, he wants this problem. He wants these 11 million people crossing the border illegally. And we see a little nutshell here. What's happening in D.C. now is they want all these illegal criminals to be able to vote now. And that's been their objective all along, is to saturate our country with illegal voters that would vote more Democratic. We live in D.C., or D.C. is a war zone now. I fear for my office staff walking home. Visitors from Kansas, I tell them, do not walk more than 3 blocks away from Capitol Hill. It's not safe. Every day we hear a hijacking. One of our staff members is assaulted. I mean, this is an everyday occurrence. We have a culture here of lawlessness. That lawlessness, again, started with Joe Biden. And we think about an open border, cashless bail, smash and grab. I'm missing one of them, but there's this absolutely a culture of lawlessness that's permeated from the top down and now from the bottom back up. That's why we introduced legislation that would usurp our constitutional authority as Congress over D.C. Remember, D.C. is not a state. They keep trying to tell you they're a state, but they're not. They're a federal district, and they are Congress has the authority over them, because folks from back home have the right to come here and petition their congressmen and to be safe. So this is a very unique situation as well. So those are a couple things at the top of my list. Were we going to do a panel now? Yeah. So I'm ready for the panel. I got more comments, but I'll save them for the panel.
Thank you, Senator. And I will invite our panelists up. So Simon will be moderating. Tom will come back up, and then also joined by Zach Smith. Thank you.
Okay. Hi again.
Good to see you. Thanks. Welcome, Senator, and thank you all for joining us in the panel. Maybe I'll go to Zach first, our senior legal fellow here at Heritage.
Hi. Thank you.
Since he hasn't spoken yet. And Zach, you've come out with a book recently called Rogue Prosecutors, which looks at how some of the crimes that Senator Marshall mentioned in D.C. are facilitated by people being released, even sometimes repeat offenders and violent offenders. Do you see any link between this and what's happening at the border, the catch and release at the border?
Yes, I do. And thank you for having this panel today, Simon, for inviting me to be a part of this. I really appreciate the opportunity. But, as my colleague and I wrote our book, Rogue Prosecutors, one of the things we found is that many of these Soros-backed and Soros-supported prosecutors actually say that when they make charging decisions, they make those in part with a view toward immigration consequences, particularly to avoid what they view as harmful immigration consequences for the people who often have committed very violent crimes. And so a couple of examples we can look at. George Gascon in Los Angeles, he actually issued a policy directive where he said that they would look at the immigration consequences. And he said, quote, all charging determinations shall be undertaken with the goal of avoiding or mitigating adverse consequences of a decision when known, possible, and time permitting. And in fact, some of the other rogue prosecutors we talk about in our book, Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, for example, he actually took it a step farther. Not only does he have policies directing his assistants to try to avoid adverse immigration consequences, he actually hired an immigration counsel whose job is to focus on figuring out how to charge individuals so that it won't trigger things like deportation. And in preparation for today's panel, I visited the Philadelphia District Attorney's website, Larry Krasner's website, and I pulled a quote from that immigration counsel. And he said, I look at every case where the defendant has been identified as an immigrant to see if there's an immigration-neutral outcome that is just. Sometimes that means creating an outcome that doesn't have any immigration consequences or minimized immigration consequences. Now, that immigration counsel went on to say that this primarily applies to only low-level nonviolent offenders. But I think what quickly becomes apparent, based on some of the stories you told, Simon, some of what we heard from Tom and the senator as well, what many of these prosecutors view as low-level offenses or nonviolent offenses are very different from what you or I or the average person on the street would view as harmless offenses. And I'll tell one more quick story to illustrate that. Another prosecutor we talk about in our book is Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. He's since been recalled and removed from office. But while he was still the district attorney in San Francisco, he admitted candidly that about half of the people dealing drugs in the Tenderloin in downtown San Francisco, which is a very troubled area, he estimated to be illegal Honduran aliens in the country illegally. And yet he said that he was troubled with the idea of charging them with drug distribution charges, with possession with intent to sell, because in his view, they were really the victims of the cartels and these other organizations. And so ironically and sadly, in 2021, the year before he was recalled and removed from office, he only charged 3 cases with possession with intent to distribute, only 3 in San Francisco. All of the other individuals that he charged, he downgraded the charges to simple possession, or more often than not to accessory after the fact charges, meaning you simply help someone else commit or cover up a crime. And so it's no wonder that you see many of these repeat offenders back on the street time and time again, even individuals who are in our country illegally, because not only is the Biden administration not doing their job, stopping these individuals when they come across the border, but unfortunately, many local officials, particularly many of these Soros-backed rogue prosecutors, are not charging appropriate illegal aliens with crimes that are appropriate because they want to avoid deportation or other adverse consequences.
Well, thanks for that. And I'm reading your book and enjoying it, although I have to take it in small doses because it's such a bleak picture. Senator, before you were in politics, I understand you're a scientist, you're a medical doctor, you're a problem solver. What can be done? Is there any possibility of fixing this at the congressional level, short of a dramatic change of heart in the White House?
No, it'll absolutely change. We need a change in the White House. No matter what we do, Joe Biden will circumvent it. I'm absolutely convinced of that. He has the laws on the books right now to stop the problem. And I'll talk about 3 very simple policy changes that would fix this. If you think about who those 11 million people are that are across the border illegally, 2 million of them were caught and released on asylum, 2 million parolees, and then about 2 million known gotaways. So simply policy changes, we could firm those up and even push the White House, in that direction. But I'm convinced Joe Biden would he has ignored the Supreme Court before as well. So until there's a change in the White House, I think that our work here is not going to change things. But I think that it would be steps for the next president. It would give President Trump a much more ease to enforce those laws as well. So switch the catch and release to remain in Mexico. Tighten up the paroles. I mean, he's breaking the law with the parole program right now. Parole is supposed to be done an individual at a time. President Trump, President Biden did about 5,000 people a year. I think that's a good number. And this president's doing, all these numbers run together here, hundreds of thousands, as I recall as well. So those are some simple solutions. And then on the known gotaways, our Border Patrol was so busy being a social worker and a nurse and a restaurant service to these people, all these people, that they can't go out there and catch those and make those known gotaways into known apprehensions.
And Tom, just on the topic of what can be done, if there were political backing for Department of Homeland Security and ICE to do their jobs, if you were back in your old job, let me put it that way, what would you do on day 1, week 1 to fix the problem?
Well, the senator is exactly right. This is going to be, Joe Biden can fix this with a stroke of a pen, first of all. We were talking about the border. Remain in Mexico was a game changer with the Trump administration. And the best part about the Remain in Mexico program, they can still claim asylum, but they wait in Mexico. But you know what? Under the Trump administration, they stopped coming. When they realized we weren't going to release the United States, they stopped coming. They stopped selling everything they own and gave it to the cartels to come to the United States, where 31% of women get sexually assaulted, people drowning in the river. Over 1,700 migrants have died crossing the border under Joe Biden, an historic record. So it saved lives. Remain in Mexico is a game changer. And catch and release, game changer. And the senator's right. The asylum abuse. Right now, what people need to understand, they'll call them asylum seekers. But if you look at immigration court data over the last 10 years, nearly 9 out of 10 people who claim asylum at the southern border never get relief from U.S. courts because they simply don't qualify or they don't show up. So why is the Biden administration releasing them? Because of Homeland Security life cycle report, the Secretary's own report says if they're in ICE detention, you get order removal. You're removed 99.7% of the time. But if you're not in an ICE detention bed and you get order removal, and like you're a family group, you leave 6% of the time. That's why they're not detaining them. That's why thousands of empty ICE beds sit there, already paid for by the taxpayer, at a fifth of the cost the mayor of New York City is paying for a hotel room. And as far as, ICE will go out and do their job. ICE will enforce the immigration law. We'll always prioritize criminals and national security threats first, but no one's off the table. If you get an order removal from a judge after due process, that order needs to be executed, because if there's no consequences for breaking our laws, you're not going to fix the border. So I came here this morning. I didn't go 150 miles an hour down the freeway. I don't want to get a ticket. I don't want my taxes. I don't want to get charged with tax evasion. So, there's a right and wrong way to enter this country. It's not okay to enter the country illegally. It's a crime. It's not okay to ignore a federal judge's order to be deported. So now the media is all over the President Trump saying we have the biggest deportation operation in history of the nation. Of course we're going to, because we just had the historic illegal immigration crisis where 9 out of 10 will be ordered removed. If we don't execute those orders, then what the hell are we doing? Shut down immigration court. Take the border patrol off the border. There's no rhyme or reason unless we enforce the laws on the books, and that's if I was in charge, we'd be doing it. I'm not waiting for somebody to go commit a crime to be arrested. If we find them and they're in the country illegally, they're going home, especially if they have a deportation order for standing. You said over 1 million final orders, and there's over 1 million final orders sitting there right now. People have been ordered removed by a federal judge after we spent billions of dollars on border security, detention, immigration courts. They've had their due process. They had their day in court. They've been ordered removed. They got to go home. That's what we have to do. There has to be consequences.
Yeah. It certainly didn't used to be controversial that if people could have whatever access they want and whatever due process, but at the end of the day, you actually had to carry out that decision, or else there is no rule of law. And Zach, when we're talking about law enforcement just in general, we know that DHS is releasing people that they have not the ability to check their criminal records back home, wherever they came from, wherever they passed through. Right. Is that something that local law enforcement and prosecutors have the ability to do? Can they pick up that slack?
It's going to be very difficult for them. Look, I think anyone who has worked in the trenches, certainly as a state or local prosecutor, or even at the federal level, would tell you it's often very difficult to get accurate criminal history for offenders, even from other jurisdictions within the United States. And so whenever you're trying to do that for crimes that may have been committed in these individuals' home countries, you can imagine how much more difficult that will be. Many local and state prosecutors simply aren't staffed or resourced or trained to get that type of information. And this type of information is so important because it plays vital roles in a number of different determinations that prosecutors will make or that judges will make. For instance, when someone is asking the judge to release them on bail pending trial, often two factors that will come into play is whether they're a flight risk or whether they pose a danger to the community if they're going to be released. Now, of course, if someone's in the country illegally, you would think they would be a flight risk. And based on the criminal history, they may also pose a danger. And yet, if state and local officials don't have that information, it's much more difficult for the judge to make that bail determination. And similarly, on the back end, this is information, these are facts that a judge would want to know when deciding what would be an appropriate sentence, setting aside any potential immigration consequences. And so it is very difficult for state and local officials to get this information, and it would aid in helping to hold these individuals accountable when they commit further crimes if that information was more readily available.
And while we're on the subject of information, Senator Marshall, you said Kansas is a long way from the border and yet is feeling the effects of a fentanyl death a day, and we know that's all coming over the border. Can you talk a little bit more about the effects in your state and how are they measured? So does law enforcement keep tabs on the crimes that are committed by people who are not legally in the country?
Right. So a couple thoughts to share. We made a big goal of our office to reach out to law enforcement. So I have one person dedicated. He spends about a third of his time in constant communication with sheriff officers, with local police officers, ICE, that type of thing. And it really came about my dad, the chief of police, saying, goodness, the White House does not have the backs of our law enforcement officers. And they're feeling very alone out there and very frustrated. So I want them to know that I care. It is hard to get all the data together. It's almost overwhelming. But to a person, whether it's a highway patrol or the sheriffs or the local police, they're seeing spikes in crime, to the point, like I said earlier, that they're not going to arrest themselves out of it. They have overwhelmed the systems. And then there's the social aspect of this as well. The human trafficking is starting to explode as well right behind it. It's all very organized. I think sometimes we think of organized crime as a bunch of uneducated people with guns. But I'm telling you, they're very sophisticated. And Tom, I'm sure, could speak to that these folks have lawyers, they have accountants. It's very orchestrated. The Chinese triad does not want violence. They don't want to draw attention to themselves, and they get upset with the cartels when they become violent as well. And then there's violence on the back end of the money laundering part of it as well. So I think the best evidence that we can see is just the overwhelming spike in crime, the number of people that are dying from fentanyl poisoning. I want to emphasize it's poisoning. These kids are not ODing, and I say kids, they're young adults. The number one killer of young adults in the nation now is fentanyl poisoning. Believe it or not, the number one killer of maternal mortality is now, after the baby's born, is women dying from fentanyl poisoning and or suicide as well. So all that data is out there just exploding right before our eyes. And again, we're not going to solve the problem on the back end until we stop the floodgate at the front end and allow our Border Patrol officers to chase bad guys that are smuggling the drugs in. It's not going to happen. What, Tom, are we maybe catching 3 or 7% of the drugs that are coming across the border? Is that an accurate number?
Yep.
And I just wanted to ask Tom to develop the concept of detainers a bit. I think I mentioned it briefly. This is something that's not always easy to get across, but could you give us a couple of examples where local law enforcement not cooperating with federal law enforcement has cost lives? Well, just a couple. We've only got...
the most target-rich environment for criminal aliens, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York. They're all sanctuary jurisdictions, so they don't accept an ICE detainer. An ICE detainer merely is a notice asking them, hey, give us a call before you release them. Give us 48 hours if you can. But regardless, give us a call before you release them. You don't have to hold them a minute past you would normally hold them on your charges. Call us before you release them on your charge and let us be there, because we have an interest in them. See, what people need to understand, when they run their prints through NCIC, they also get run through DHS databases. So ICE gets notice, okay, you got a guy sitting in Holman County Jail. He's been deported twice. He's there under a felony charge. So we know he's in the jail. We know he's sitting there. We have biometrics matching him. So we send a detainer. Let us have access to this guy. But the sanctuary jurisdictions, and some sheriffs will argue, well, we have sanctuary policies because we want to protect the immigrant community and make them feel comfortable coming to police if they're victims of witness. That's a bunch of crap. It's a lie. But they've had this message out there, and a lot of people are buying off on it. Let me explain what's really happening. ICE wants access to the jail. We don't want to talk to the victim or witness. We want access to the guy that you locked up. You locked him up for some reason. Either he's a public safety threat or a flight risk. We want access to that taxpayer-funded jail to talk to the bad guy that you locked in a jail cell. That's what we want. And I would argue, and they say, well, it makes victim witnesses nervous if we're cooperating with ICE. Really? Do you think the victim and witness wants that guy released back in the community? Do you think the victim wants to see that guy back in the neighborhood? Do you think the witness wants to see that guy back in the neighborhood? It's just wrong. In its message, it's just a stone-cold lie. And I would say this. First of all, sanctuary cities are sanctuaries for criminals, period. They're hiding criminals. Number two, if ICE can't arrest a bad guy in the safety and security of the jail where ICE officers are safe, they know he don't have weapons behind the line. But once they release him, now they got to arrest him on his soil, in his place where he has access to who knows what. So it makes ICE's job much more dangerous. It makes it less efficient, because now rather than just one guy taking custody in the jail, now we got to send a whole team out because of the officer safety issues. Third, the victims and witness don't want the bad guy back in their neighborhood either. And if you went and had a community meeting and had a town hall in the immigrant community and asked them a simple question, would you rather have ICE operating in your jail or your neighborhood? They're going to say jail, because even though they're in the country legally and they committed a crime entering the country legally, many of them, once they get here, they're God-fearing people. They want to raise a family in a safe neighborhood. They don't want a predator in their neighborhood either. They don't want somebody convicted DUI 10 times in their neighborhood either. So this whole fallacy of sanctuary cities protect immigrant communities is a bunch of crap. Who is MS-13 attacked mostly? People in the immigrant community. Study after study has shown that illegal immigrant will most likely reoffend in the community in which he lives, the immigrant community. So if we summarize now, Sanctuary cities put the immigrant community at greater risk of ICE arrest because now ICE has to go in the neighborhood where they're probably going to find others, not just a target, and they're not going to walk away from them. Number two, it puts the immigrant community at greater risk of crime because the guy's likely to reoffend in the same neighborhood he lives in. Third, it puts the immigrant community at greater risk of ICE arrest. Fourth, it makes it very dangerous for the ICE officer and as a public safety issue. When I was an ICE agent, I can't tell you how many U.S. citizens I arrested for harboring an illegal alien in their place of employment or the home. Harboring, it's a felony. So tell me what's different from a sanctuary jail having somebody in their facility that we have biometric data that is in the country illegally after deportation, which is a felony, and we're not allowed access? Is that not harboring by the near definition? No, I said I was an ICE director, and of course the left twisted it all. Say, Holman wants politicians, prosecuted in sanctuary cities. That's not what I said. I said DOJ needs to look at this issue and see, do they have the right to harbor a criminal alien that we know based on biometric information that's in that facility right now? Do they have the right to keep us out? That's what I wanted DOJ to look at, and President Trump was suing the DOJ. I'm not suing DOJ, but suing the sanctuary cities with DOJ is another thing. When Biden signed 94 executive orders abolishing everything we did, he also stopped the lawsuit that DOJ had against sanctuary cities. Sanctuary cities make communities less safe. They make immigrant communities less safe. They make law enforcement less safe. If you ask any cop in New York City, would you want to work with ICE? They will say yes. Every time I walk out of Fox headquarters and I'm up there doing a story, numerous officers walk up and introduce themselves. They want to work with ICE. Law enforcement wants to work with ICE. So, the sheriffs, that percentage of sheriffs that support sanctuary cities, shame on you. You obviously forgot what it's like to be a law enforcement officer and you became a politician because you're running for election. Public safety is in danger in this country like I've never seen it before. Now is the time for us all law enforcement work together. Didn't we learn at 9/11? Stop the stovepipes. Law enforcement should work with law enforcement. And that's what should happen. So you asked what I do? I gave you a long answer. There's a lot we would do. But we got to change the rules we're playing by today because it's just putting the public at great risk.
I wanted to do just a follow-up story that how this has now reached rural America. So in Kansas, we don't have sanctuary cities, and our sheriff officers support ICE. We had a situation in southwest Kansas where the cartel was controlling 30 people as indentured servants. Local sheriffs make the arrest. They try to contact ICE, and ICE is hesitant to come out there because of the cultural change at the top here. They've been told to do everything you can to avoid the situation. We had to beg ICE to come work with the local sheriff's officers, and basically all the ICE officers are in Kansas City, a 6-hour drive away. So this is coming to rural America. The cartel is alive and well. The cartel literally has posts, and so does the Chinese triad. I mean, they have posts set up across the state of Kansas now, very much involved in the communities. Again, the human trafficking along with the drug trafficking.
And I have to jump on this because it's important. The senator talked about human trafficking earlier. You talked about it. What is this administration done? They have prohibited ICE from doing worksite enforcement operations. The number one place where we find victims of trafficking, we find forced labor cases and peonage. ICE can't do worksite enforcement operations. That is the source. The number one place where we find victims of trafficking, and they're not allowed to do it. So Joe Biden wants to do a press conference on trafficking, how serious it is, at the same time not letting law enforcement do the job. So Senator's 100% right. ICE can't respond to calls like this out of fear of retaliation from the department. That is a stone cold fact. I appreciate you bringing that up.
I've been to the border 5 times, and I think one of the most depressing things of my last visit was encountering a group of Border Patrol agents, and one who's couldn't have been older than 35 said to me, I hate coming to work every day. And this is a guy who joined to do all the things that he thought he was going to do as a Border Patrol agent, and he's not allowed to do any of them. We're getting close to the end. Zach, I just want to ask you, and I'm hoping you'll end on a hopeful note, but I'm not sure. We see this sanctuary city, this rogue prosecutor ideology where it's almost against the rules for people to prosecute and to do their jobs from local law enforcement all the way up to the national level. Is this ideology something that will eventually wane and sanity will return? Do you see any glimmers of hope?
Well, I don't know if I'll be Mr. Sunshine this afternoon, unfortunately, but there are some glimmers of hope. Obviously, Chesa Boudin, who I mentioned earlier, the voters of San Francisco there recalled and removed him from office. We've also seen other rogue prosecutors being removed from office, either by losing election or being forced out of office because of their refusal to do their jobs. But it's important to keep in mind that these rogue prosecutors are still in office in many cities around the country, often many of our nation's biggest population centers. And in addition to not prosecuting an entire host of crimes, they are taking special care not to hold illegal aliens accountable when they commit crimes as well. And if I can quickly, I'll give one quick story out of Fairfax County, Virginia, only miles from where we sit today. It's one of the largest counties in Northern Virginia, and it builds on something that Tom was talking about just a minute ago in terms of detainers. There was a Honduran immigrant. He was in the country illegally. He was charged with child sex offenses, and yet he was released from custody, not held with bail, because Fairfax County officials, including the rogue prosecutor in Fairfax County, believe that most individuals should be released pending trial. Well, fast forward a few months, guess what happened? He was charged with more child sex offenses, and yet he was released from custody once again, and eventually ICE did go pick him up. But these are the types of individuals that are being released back into our streets, and I think the more that voters, the more that all of us as citizens start to understand what is happening and the harmful consequences of these policies, which unfortunately we see with the rising violent crime rates and the stories that you highlight in your database that you just talked about, I think more and more voters understand that it's important to have policies where if you break the law, you're held accountable.
Yeah, and at the very least, the voters deserve to have the facts so they can make their own minds up. Perhaps I'll give each of you a minute just to any closing thoughts.
So a true story, I took an airplane here today from New York, and the captain of the airplane recognized me. And he asked me a question I get asked all the time. He goes, "Why do you always look so angry?" I see you on TV, you're always angry. I see you testifying in front of Congress, you're always angry, because I am angry. Because I mentioned earlier about 31% of women admitted to being sexually assaulted making this journey. And, you know, we handed this administration the most secure border in my lifetime, and they unsecured it on purpose. Joe Biden's the first president in the history of this nation who unsecured a border. Every president I worked for, starting with Ronald Reagan, took steps to secure the border, including Clinton and Obama. Because they understood you can't have national security if you don't have border security. You got to know what's coming in, who's coming in, why they're coming in, where they're coming in. But no one did more than President Trump. But Joe Biden actually came in office and unsecured the border on purpose. And what's that result in? When President Trump had illegal immigration at a 45-year low, illegal immigration was down 83% to 90%, depending on what time frame you looked at. When illegal immigration was down 83%, when 83% less people are coming, how many women didn't get raped? How many children didn't drown in the river? How many Americans didn't die of fentanyl overdoses because the border was secure? How many known suspected terrorists didn't make in the country? How many billions did the cartels not make, right? Under Joe Biden, we got over 1,700 migrants that died in U.S. soil, a record. 148,000 overdose deaths of fentanyl, a record. 358 people on terrorist watch lists on the southern border, a record. Trump, 11 in 4 years. So I am angry. And I want to leave you with this. While we're sitting here in this nice room, having a nice event, I'm fired up again. Think of this, and please take it home with you. While you're sitting here today, women are being raped on the southern border because the border is open. The cartels are taking advantage. A child will be sexually assaulted today on the southern border. Someone's going to die today on the southern border, most likely a woman or child. That is what's happening right now while we sit here, because this administration refuses to secure the border. We gave them the blueprints. They have the blueprints. They can fix this tomorrow, as the senator said. But because they're not, people are dying. And that's why I'm pissed off. And more moms and dads are going to lose their children. They're going to bury them. More angel moms and dads are coming because of the crime that's raging in this country. So I'll leave you with that thought. Don't think this is just something you just go home and forget about. I don't. I think about that dying person on the border tonight. I think about the young lady who's going to get raped multiple times by the cartel members. I think about the known suspected terrorists coming across this border. So that's why I'm angry. I hope you leave here today. I hope you're angry too. And call your congressman and your senator, I don't care what side they're on, and tell them to get it, demand they secure this border. And most importantly, get to the voting booth in November and vote for border security. because border security is national security. If you care about the safety and security of this country, get involved and do something in November, please.
Amen.
Thank you.
You know, Tom, spoken like a true law enforcement officer, you remind me of my dad in so many ways, that there is day and there's night, there's right and there's wrong. John Adams, our second president, said that the Constitution was written for a moral and religious society. And I think the same can be true of our laws, that they are written for a moral and religious society. We're assuming if there's a stop sign there and I'm driving perpendicular that 99% of people are going to stop. Otherwise, I'd have to slow down for every stop sign. We've become an immoral and non-religious society. You know, people ask me what the hope or what the solution is. I still think that going back to the values this nation was founded upon, that most of us were raised upon, that faith is important, that family is important, that community, education, and hard work are values. And certainly we have to value law and order, and that starts at our border and these elections that have led to attorney generals, district attorneys with cashless bells, and then policies of defunding the police, allowing riots to go on unchecked. If you give them an inch, they take a mile. That's why we have to prosecute every person that's breaking windows, vandalizing, graffiti, why we have to prosecute people crossing the border. Otherwise, it's just a license to steal. If we don't need a rocket science solution, we just need to go back to the basic values that this nation was founded upon. Thank you.
Amen.
Well, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
thank you all, Tom, Senator Marshall, Zach, for being on our panel today and for being on the right side of this fight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.